Hey guys, so I recently released a mini course called Troubleshoot Your Houseplants, and I included that in the Houseplant Masterclass. So I thought today we'd actually take a look at some of the plants that I have and figure out what might be wrong with them. This episode is brought to you by HelloFresh. So I have two plants that are here. The one right in front of me is a Selenocereus undatus, which used to be known as Hylocereus undatus. It is commonly known as dragon fruit, and it is a plant that is typically grown in more tropical areas. It's not a usual indoor plant, but I've had it growing indoors. And then this one to the right is called Opuntia humifusa. And if you remembered my 365 days of plants, I did actually mention this one, and both of these look pretty bedraggled and sad, but only one of these is actually having an issue, and that's something that we're going to be covering today. So if you took a look at these plants, I'd love for you to imagine what could have actually gone wrong with this one in particular, because the Opuntia is actually in fine shape, but the dragon fruit that I have in front of me is not. And actually, when I first saw this plant maybe 4 or 5 days ago, it was a little bit of a brighter green, but it has now turned this really sullen yellow-brown color. And if you could see up close, some of this is actually quite mushy. It seems more water-soaked, and it's lost a lot of its turgor, which means like its pressure. And I don't want to touch this plant too much because it still has these little spikes on it, and it will get actually in my fingers, and I'm not wearing gloves. This plant, looks very similar. It's a little bit more wrinkly, although it has quite a bit of turgor, so it doesn't have that mushiness that this plant has. It's sometimes hard to look at a plant and say, oh, I know exactly what happened to it without knowing the context. And that's actually a question I get from a lot of folks. A lot of folks will show me their plant and they say, hey, what's wrong with my plant? Well, without knowing a little bit more of the context behind that plant, it's very hard to determine, oh, that's exactly what went wrong. So I'd love for you to actually build up some of those skills to observe what's happening in your plants yourself and say, okay, I actually know what went wrong, and I want to understand a little bit more of the physiology of what's happening with that plant. So I will tell you that I went away, and this plant, this dragon fruit, was on my fire escape. And unfortunately, it dipped under 32 degrees Fahrenheit, which is around 0 degrees Celsius. I think it ended up it was like 28 degrees Fahrenheit, so it went below freezing. And what you're seeing here in this plant is essentially freezer burn. So this plant got too cold, and it damaged the cells. And in fact, it probably just killed all the cells. So what is actually happening when a plant freezes? Well, at first, maybe some of the cells on the outside are freezing, but what really could damage a plant is the intracellular freezing. So that is the freezing that happens on the inside of the cells. So what's happening in the plant is that some of the cells have ice buildup, and that could actually dehydrate the cells. So it will pull out some of the solutes, and the cells will start to dehydrate. The cell membranes could start to rupture. And the rupturing could be happening because of the ice crystals actually puncturing the cell membranes. It could be an electrical puncture, so maybe some more solutes are on the outside than on the inside, and the osmotic pressure builds up and then removes some of those, and it dehydrates and it punctures the cell. But what you get is the result of this, and the cell starts to look mushy. And like I said, when it was outside, it was a nice bright green. I brought it in and it turned to essentially mush. So is this plant going to come back? I would say probably not, unless it has stored energy in its roots. And if you think about it, that's how a lot of plants store their energy over the winter. So the upper portions actually are deciduous, or they tend to quote unquote die in the winter months, and then they store all their carbohydrates in maybe say their thickened roots or maybe thickened stems like bulbs, tubers, and corms, for example. So if we think about like a potato, or you think about an onion, you know, all of that energy is being stored underground. Now, because this is a tropical plant, it typically is growing in maybe like a zone 10 or a zone 11, and heck, I live in a zone 5. So should I have taken this in before the freeze happened? Absolutely. You know, is this plant going to come back? Probably not, because it hasn't developed or evolved the strategies in order to be able to survive a winter cold. So, lesson learned. But if I pull this one over, so this is my Opuntia humifusa, this one also looks sad. And I thought it was funny because a lot of the comments on my 365 days of plants said, oh my God, that plant looks so bad. But Opuntia humifusa is quite a miraculous plant, because this is one of the northernmost, in fact I think it is the northernmost cacti, so it actually goes up and through Canada. So it is even in grow zones that are colder than New York, and it could pretty much handle around -11 degrees Fahrenheit. So typically it doesn't get that cold in New York City, so this plant is actually okay. Now, how does this plant, which is a cactus, survive in this temperature versus this plant not survive and it's also a cactus? Well, it turns out that this has different strategies to survive in the cold. For one, it doesn't look as pretty as it does in the summer months. I would say late May, June is when it actually starts perking up on my fire escape. There's also one in the neighborhood that is growing on the ground in a planter, and I always walk by that one as I go to the chicken coop, and that one starts to look good a little bit earlier. So I would say like early May is when that starts to perk up. But it's kind of miraculous because you'll have these wrinkled, kind of sloppy, droopy looking pads, and then as the spring and summer starts to warm it up, it'll start to stand a little bit more upright. And then in the summer months, it'll start to put out these really beautiful yellow flowers. And when I filmed this in 365 Days of Plants, I filmed it, I believe, in February, or maybe it was like early March. And I ran it maybe in May or June, and people are like, that looks awful. But this is exactly how the plant is supposed to look. And the way that it strategizes its cold temperature is that it starts to produce more solutes. And those solutes inside the cells are usually sugars, and more specifically also sugar alcohols. So you probably have heard the word sugar alcohol thrown around a little bit. I sometimes hear it in nutritional circles. So some sugar alcohols are used for diabetics, for instance, because our body doesn't digest sugar alcohols. It actually could make our tummy a little sick or cause like loose stools, but they often use it as a sugar supplement because it doesn't add calories, because our body doesn't really accept it as a true sugar, like honey, for instance, or cane sugar, for instance. But sugar alcohols are also used in antifreeze. So if you think of like glycol is a sugar alcohol, and that is actually used in antifreeze. So that's what you would use in, say, your car, or like a Winnebago or anything if you're camping. So that is, antifreeze is essentially synthesized from plant sugars or sugar alcohols. And the sugar alcohol that's produced in Opuntia humifusa is actually mannitol. And again, mannitol could be used as an antifreeze. So this plant is, as soon as the temperatures start to cool, this plant starts pumping out sugars, which make it a little bit more jelly-like on the inside, and also sugar alcohols, which lowers the freezing temperature. So this is able to survive in the cold, and that's how it actually pushes through the winter, and that is how this plant has evolved. And that is why you could see this plant in the northern ranges of New York and also Canada. So it's quite fascinating. Not every plant could survive the cold, but many plants have learned different strategies, like I mentioned, in their bulbs or their tubers or their corms, or even behind their stems and leaves. So, okay, so say you knew absolutely nothing about these plants. How can you tell that this one is dead and that this one is still alive? Well, there are some indications that show that this one still has quite a bit of life in it. First of all, this one, when I'm feeling it, it is quite mushy. So it's similar like if you threw like a broccoli in a freezer and you started to feel that broccoli and what that looks like and what it feels like when you actually take it out of the freezer and then you let it thaw. Also, there's a lot of brown bits on here, so I don't know if the chlorophyll would ever come back. But the only way that you could see is if you actually keep this plant and you see if it comes back in the spring and summer months. You know, maybe you are lucky and the roots have stored a bunch of carbohydrates and maybe you will see new growth. So we will see if that happens. On this one, remember when I said that this is actually quite mushy? This one, believe it or not, even though it's rippled and wrinkled, is very firm. So it has some of that turgor left in the pads. Additionally, you might be able to see that some of it is still green. And that's a really good sign because it shows that the chlorophyll hasn't been damaged. Now there is this kind of purplish and red kind of forming on this opuntia. And oftentimes when cacti or even some succulents start to form this redness or purple, it's undergoing some stress, so it might be undergoing some cold stress, but it actually helps protect the plant as well. So the fact that it is showcasing some of this like purplish red color and has some of the chlorophyll, then that's a-okay. Now, I want you to totally disregard the pigeon feathers and the pigeon poop on this because I am leaving this out on my fire escape all throughout the winter. And typically I would bring this plant indoors, but this time I'm actually going to leave it out and see how it does. But otherwise, I think this plant looks great despite the fact that it is healed over the edges of the planter pot and is looking a little wrinkled. These are some of the things that we actually talk about in Troubleshoot Your Houseplants, and we go through viral diseases and fungal diseases and bacterial diseases and more. So if you get a chance, check out that course, and I hope you learned something today. All right, guys, talk to you later. This episode is brought to you by HelloFresh, which I just got delivered before a massive snowstorm, which was super helpful since I couldn't rush out to the grocery store. And considering I don't have many restaurant options when I'm here in the country, and I don't always feel like coming up with my own recipes, HelloFresh gives me a really good alternative to healthy and delicious meals. So I got the vegetarian meals, which took me more or less about, I would say, 20 minutes to prepare. So it was super quick, wasn't fussy at all, and everything is portioned out. So unless you don't eat all the food, which we did because it was delicious, there was no food waste at all. It's also a major plus that the packaging is pretty much all recyclable, so we ended up with very little waste. And the best thing yet is the company has donated over 4 million meals last year to charities, which they'll continue to do, which is just great. So if you're interested in trying them out, you could go to hellofresh.com and use my code SUMMERRAIN10, that's SUMMERRAYNE 10, and then you'll get 10 free meals, including free shipping.